Our scripture reading will be 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through 16. 1 Peter 3, 13 through 16. Now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame.
God is an awesome, awesome God. I'm glad that He is my God, and I know that you're glad that He is your God. My uncle, just before he passed away, had a conversation with me by phone. And what stands out in this conversation is that it was, as far as I can remember, one of the first conversations that I'd actually had with this uncle. This is my mom's oldest brother. And he was just released from the hospital. And he was sharing with me that while he was in the hospital, that he went through a little bit of a depression and these phases of emotional bouts. He was frustrated, become fearful. He was bothered because he, just prior to that episode, was the perfect specimen of health. He was a strong man, big man, athlete all of his life. And now all of a sudden he'd withered down and was dealing with a lack of control over his own body. And he found himself 6'4", broken down in this hospital, weeping and crying, alone. And he opened up his eyes at one point. And a nurse who had been attending him came and looked at him. She said, "Do you believe in God?" And he answered, yes, I do. She said, "Well, act like it." And he told me, he said, "Thomas, what struck me the most was not the words that she used, because some would argue that that's not real good bedside manner. What struck him the most was how true the words were. That if in fact you do believe in God, there are certain things that we go through as disciples that ought not ever even come up on the radar in our thinking and our behavior, because we act according to that belief. The Apostle Peter, I believe, is writing in a manner in which he is encouraging those believers that are going through trial, that are in the face of severe and intense suffering, to act like they believe in God. The purpose of this sermon, then, is to study this particular assigned text with an emphasis on verses 13 through 16 and the message of hope in the face of trouble, so that we understand the contextual implications and apply these truths in the various contexts of our life. In order to accomplish this purpose, this sermon will be developed around three major points that all come right out of verses 13 through 15. I want to talk to you, first of all, about a prophetic picture that's implied in the text. Number two, I want to talk to you about the posture that Peter prescribes from the text. And then number three, the principles that are practically applied right out of the text. In 1 Peter 3, at verse 13 and 14, Peter opens up with this statement: "Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear and do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled." Point number one, the prophetic picture in the text is in the last clause of verse number 14. He makes this statement, do not fear their intimidation and do not be troubled. What we may not know on a surface reading is that Peter is actually quoting from Isaiah chapter 8. And he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 8. And you would remember in your study that anytime one of the New Testament writers references an Old Testament thought, it's not just proof texting or something that they say in passing to another point. Rather, it is an implication for them to bring in their mind, to bring into their thinking the dialogue that was going on from that reference point. And so Peter grabs a hold of a statement out of the work of Isaiah. In fact, he grabs a hold of a season of time in which he is bringing the readers, the listeners in his context, back to a point that's very similar to what was going on in Isaiah's prophecy. You would remember in your mind's eye, go back and put this in your notes if nothing else, but you would remember in Isaiah when he wrote what he wrote, that in chapter 6 of Isaiah, that Uzziah had just died. This king who had prospered for 52 some odd years. This king who brought prosperity and plush and peace to the nation. Chapter 7 then, right after that, Ahaz is enthroned. And when Ahaz is enthroned, that is right in the throes just before the Assyrian persecution. Now here's where Isaiah writes, and here's where Peter quotes. Peter quotes from the section of Isaiah chapter 8, verses 11 all the way down to about verse number 22 or so. And this is what he does. He lets them know. He reminds you and I of what Isaiah wrote in that time, saying this, that Assyrian captivity is going to come upon you. Assyrian captivity will sweep you like a flood. It will be so severe that you will be up to your neck in suffering, up to your neck in persecution, up to your neck in trouble, up to your neck in overthrow. But don't focus on that. Watch the quote. Do not be intimidated and do not be troubled. Peter grabs the same sentiment of Isaiah, brings it into his message in 1 Peter, and does the exact same thing that Isaiah does. Isaiah said, rather than you being focused on Assyrian captivity, rather than you being focused on the suffering that's coming, rather than you being worried about what they will do to you, fix your eyes on the Lord of hosts. Beautiful text. Fix your eyes on Jehovah, the self-existent one who is the king over armies that can beat any army. Peter, what are you saying? Isaiah, what are you saying? Isaiah says to Peter in his quote that keep your eyes on the one who's got the power to keep you in your trouble. Peter says, keep your eyes on the one who's got the power to keep you in any trouble. Watch him pivot. He moves from this idea of suffering. And you know in the text, it's already been covered from the background information. It's already been implied through the series itself that there's suffering and trouble and persecution in every chapter that Peter brings up. In chapter 1, he talks about various trials. Chapter 2, he'll talk about suffering unjustly. Chapter 3, he'll mention suffering. Chapter 4, he'll talk about being reviled. He'll talk about fiery ordeals. He'll talk about suffering unjustly. Suffering is all throughout the letter. But while all of that is going on, Peter brings it into this one particular section here, and he references Isaiah to bring us to a reality that you and I need to see even right now. Look at 13. I want you to see 13 and 14, how they marry together. The question then that he asks, who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good, is answered by the reality that if God is on your side, that there's nothing that you and I go through that God cannot see you through. There's nothing that we deal with that God is not bigger than. There's no issue that you and I will face that our God has not already insulated us from. Truth be told, what Peter says is, because God is our God, we need to act like it. I know this is not a shout chapel. Let me move on. What Peter does in this text, and watch this. He grabs a hold of all of these implications about how we ought not to fear and how we ought not to allow the trouble to eclipse our reality. Pointing back to Isaiah, he uses language that almost parallels exactly. As Isaiah says to his audience, don't focus on the flood-like issues that are coming your way. look at the Lord of hosts. Peter says in 1 Peter 3 and verse 14 and 15, watch the segue. Do not fear their intimidation and do not be troubled. Watch the but in verse 15. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is within you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Peter moves from this prophetic picture in the past to point number 2, a present posture in the face of persecution. The conjunction that he uses here is a contrasting conjunction, but is used in a contrasting conjunction, not necessarily to marry information, but more used rather to show a different kind of posture. Instead of being intimidated and instead of being fearful, you and I need to focus on the Christ. Just like he says in Isaiah, rather than being caught up in the sweep that's coming, focus on the Lord of hosts. Same imagery, but a different emphasis here. The contrast then should leave the disciple with distinction in their mind and defense in their manner. You're going to see that in verse 15. It will leave us with distinction in our mind and defense in our manner. Where are you getting distinction in your mind? Look at the first clause of the text. Sanctify Christ. Verse 15. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. Let's work on that for just a minute. This notion of distinction in your mind ought to grab you by saying this. If you and I have Jesus as set apart in your mind, as circumscribed in our thinking. Some translations just simply say sanctify, and that's all right. But sometimes we let churchy words, we let Christianese stop us from doing what it ought to do. Sanctify, by that Peter means draw a circle around who Jesus is. Set it apart and make it distinct in your thinking who Jesus is. Circumscribe and don't let anything bombard the notion of who Jesus is. Well, Peter, remind me what you're trying to say here. When you and I think of who Christ is, we ought to remind ourselves, number one, he is the perfect example of what faith is all about. Throughout the text, Peter will use the implication that Jesus is the example of what it means to suffer. Jesus is the example of what it means to have character under persecution. Jesus is the Son of God, the resurrected Lord, the one who's sitting on the right hand of God. He is currently ruling. He holds everything together. Think about the theology of our word. He holds everything together by his word. Everything is waiting on who he is. Every angel is waiting on the nod of who Jesus is. He's not just somebody. He's the one that we ought to bow to and we ought to think about as Lord and sovereign. Keep him set aside in your thinking. But then he also helps us to appreciate within the context of the book itself. Watch how Peter would argue how important Jesus is just in the context of the letter of Peter. Peter would argue that Jesus is the propitiation of our sins. 1 Peter chapter 2. He would argue that he is the guardian of your soul. He would argue that he is the living spirit who has preached in the heart of every prophet that ever exists. 1 Peter chapter 3. He is the example of how you and I answer those that accuse you and how we sit with peace and joy in the midst of the fire. He is the shepherd of our life. He is the one who is the guardian of your soul. Now, let me just let you know something. If the guardian of your soul is the resurrected Lord, the uncontested, intergalactical champion of the entire universe, if that's the guardian of your soul, who in the world are you going to worry about at all? If he's sovereign and your soul is in his hands, you should never at all worry about anybody that you deal with. You shouldn't worry about sickness. You shouldn't worry about death. You shouldn't worry about persecution. You shouldn't worry about friends. You shouldn't worry about enemies. If Jesus is sovereign in your life, if he's set apart and you have submitted to him being your Lord, your life is absolutely secure. And I think many of us forget sometimes that he's in control. One of the things that this text helps us to remember before I move to the second clause, one of the things this text helps us to remember is that trouble is designed by God. He's in the trouble. He's in control of the trouble. And he makes us better as a result of the trouble. It's already been covered in chapter 1. But you would remember the part of the reason why God allows you and I to go through the issues that we go through in chapter 1. He would make that statement, you are in diverse trouble if need be. That God every now and then will allow you to go through something that gets the real you to the surface. And the real you can't come to the surface unless the fire of life has been hot enough to refine all of the foolishness, all of the faithlessness, all of the fearfulness, to get it off of you so the real you can shine forth and glow and get glory for God. But he says not only do you need to have distinction in your mind. Look at the B clause of the text. You need to have defense in your manner. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. Watch the B clause. Always being ready to make a defense to anyone that asks you for an account for the hope that is within you. Typically, when we deal with that particular section of verse 15, the inclination is to solely lean on an apologetic posture that makes a defense for the factual aspects of Christianity. And that's right. Apologetic posture that articulates the confines and the various ramifications of the faith. And that's right. But it's not all. There's more to what Peter is arguing, I believe, in this text, especially from the context of the letter itself. By Peter's argumentation here, or by Peter's use of the term, a defense in your manner is not just you and I being ready to make your case with what you say, but be ready to make your case by what you do. The argument of your life is the best apologetic that anyone will ever have. The demonstration of your character, the ability for you to explicate the nature of King Jesus in anything that comes your way is the truest form of you saying that Christianity is in fact real. It is in fact relevant. It is the most robust worldview that an individual could have. I'm going to let you know by what I say, but more than what I say, I will show you by what I do. In the context here in verse 15, if you go back and look at the parallelisms that's all the way through the text, you will remember coming out of chapter 2, he describes Jesus, who not only taught in his entire lifetime, but he argues his sovereignty by the way he faces the cross. In chapter 3, he would give this beautiful power to women of God. And he says to women of God, you've got the power to change the heart and mind of men, not by what you say, but just by what you do. He goes on through the text then, and he marries this beautiful argumentation that it's more than what you say, it's also what you do. And right here in this text then, the defense, the apologetic of who God is more than what we say. It's lived out by what we do as well. Peter is referenced. He's borrowed theologically in the thinking of a number of important individuals in our time, contemporaries that we know, writers that we know. Francis Schaeffer, for instance, is one. Francis Schaeffer says this about Peter, or in dialogue about Peter. He says that the marriage of the love of God and the holiness of God, those two things brought together, keeps men and women from just being caricatures of the faith and allows them to embody the character of the faith. Did y'all catch what I just said? Instead of you and I just being big cartoon drawings of Christianity, we are the embodiment. We are the fullness of Christianity through and through. This is principled in this idea of you and I marrying not only the defense of my belief in my explanation, but the defense of my belief in my exhibition of King Jesus. Let me give you point number 3, because some of y'all are getting tired. And if you're not, I'm getting tired. Look at the C clause as it moves into verse 16. You and I ought to have this distinction in our mind and this defense in our manner. But we also, point number 3, ought to live out certain principles in the face of persecution. He says, do all of this, yet with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience, so that in the things which you are slandered, those who revile you, and your good behavior. I'm sorry, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. Watch what he does. Point number 3. Point number 3, he gives practical principles that push back persecution. The defense and the distinction are undergirded not just by the mechanics of defending the faith, but they're undergirded by you and I having a godly nature. These phrases are seen by the 3 terms that are described at the end of verse 15 going into 16. The first thing Peter brings up is he says you ought to defend and you ought to make sure that you know who Jesus is, but do it with the right character. Do it with meekness. Do it with gentleness. You understand how meekness is used throughout the Word of God. It's not you being docile and you being pitiful and you being weak and you being this lowly individual. It's you having all the capacity, all the power. You've got the right. I could shut you down. I could about to say smack you, but that wouldn't be politically correct. I could do some things that would actually hurt you, but I'm not going to rely on my own power. I'm going to rely on the capability of God, even though I have the power. That's meekness. The idea of gentleness then is not that I'm trying to win the argument by being more erudite or being more logical or being more savvy than you. I want to win the argument by the nudge of God the Spirit. My character is going to give room for God to do what he's going to do. But in addition to my character, I want to make sure that my conscience is clear. See verse 16? I want to make sure that I keep a good conscience. Watch he gives a so that clause. Make sure your conscience is clear so that, watch what he says, so that the things which you are slandered about, that these things don't come back and haunt you. Peter, what are you saying? You make sure that in all of this action and all of your talking and all of your posturing, make sure that what they're saying about you isn't really true. Did y'all catch that? Some of us are really marvelous actors. I'll let that sit for a minute. I've been in the seat just like you. I've sat and studied just like you. I've gone through the routine just like you. But I've lied just like many of you. I've gone through the notion of praying at the right time, saying the right things, when inwardly and even privately that wasn't the case. Here's the thing you want to always remember about the folly of being an actor among members of the body is that you may fool everybody in the audience, but God sees everything. A clear conscience will keep you in the face of God pure, but a guilty conscience will haunt you as you pose one way and privately you're doing something else. By the way, it's interesting that he will bring up conscience later on in the text, has that conscience is the very thing that appeals to God. Notice something about our God then. God is the one who says, I'm not really, I see what you're doing with everybody else. I know how you go through the motions with everybody else. Oh, you look churchy, you look holy, but I know what's really going on. Peter says, make sure your character and your conscience is true so that what they say has no bearing. Not that anybody else is going to find it out, but that God himself would say, that's my child. I know they're doing the right thing. I know that they are holy and without blemish. And he helps us to appreciate, third of all, that someone is always watching you. Someone is always looking at you. And even if you don't see physical eyes, remember, there is an all-seeing eye watching you. So what? 3 things I want to give you and I'm going to land. Number 1, I want to challenge you. From this text, always see that God is bigger than your problems. He's bigger than your persecution. He's bigger than your suffering. Remember that reflection in Isaiah. You see your troubles and your persecution coming like a flood. Don't focus on that. Focus on the Lord of hosts. Paralleled in 1 Peter chapter 3. You see trial all around you, but don't allow that to discourage you. See Jesus. Challenge number 2 then. Make sure that you are clear who Christ is in your life. Make sure that it is absolutely unmistakable that He is Lord, He is sovereign, He is your propitiation, He is the guardian of your soul. And then number 3, maintain the harmony. This is your third challenge. Maintain the harmony of conviction and character. Don't just know the Lord. Live it out. I shared with you about my uncle who had gotten out the hospital, and he had that conversation with me. Again, that was the first conversation I'd ever really had with my uncle. 2 days later, I got a call from my aunt. And the call from my aunt was that my uncle, on the way home from the hospital, had fallen outside of the hospital, hit his head, was rushed back into the hospital, blood on his brain, and a day later, he died. She was broken. She was shocked. The entire family was shocked. And I remember that God provided an opportunity for me to share with the family. And I shared with them the last words that Uncle gave me was that if we really believe in God, we ought to act like it. God bless you.